Hey, my name is Tristan Gwynn.
Hello, my name is Max Fuenmayor.
Hello, my name's Samantha West.
Hello, my name is Daniel O'Brien, and we're going to be talking about the impact of the IMF in Egypt. So first I'm going to talk about the function of the International Monetary Fund. The IMF is an international financial institution that offers loans and structural development assistance to member states. They operate by requiring borrowing countries to undergo a certain set of fiscal policy changes known as structural adjustment programs, which are intended to aid the country in improving its economic growth and attract foreign investment. The IMF also monitors economic and social development progress of member states and provides documented analysis for economic research, as well as providing professional assistance to countries in need. So going more in depth on the Structural Adjustment Program policy measures, the Structural Adjustment Program for borrowing countries involves a certain set of policy adjustments that the government must pursue. These involve devaluing the currency to obtain a more competitive stance in the global market, raising interest rates to encourage domestic saving and foreign investment, and reducing growth in the money supply in order to stabilize inflation and improve the budget deficit. The overall goal of SAPs is to ensure that the country is able to put borrowed funds to good use and achieve development goals in an efficient manner. Despite this, these policy measures can result in periods of economic recession during stabilization and often result in public discontent, as I will talk about later in the presentation.
Looking at the economic development in Egypt, it can be split up into these three groups: pre-stabilization, phase 1 from 1991 to 1993, stabilization, phase 2 from 1993 to 1994, and stabilization and growth, phase 3 from 1994 to 1997. The key indicators and areas that mark development according to the IMF data is real GDP, inflation rate, and total debt for domestic indicators, and net international reserves and average exchange rate for foreign indicators. Phase 1 was from 1991 to 1993 and was characterized by a return of flight capital to the banking system and had both external and internal forces and influences. There were major effects seen on the nominal and real interest rates, saving and investments, and capital inflows. During this time, policy responses were aggressive sterilization, which were policies that were seeking to limit the effect of inflows and outflows of capital on the money supply, and there was a decrease in the nominal and real interest rates, as well as decrease in savings and investments. There was a deceleration in inflation, along with a depreciation in the real exchange rate during this time. Throughout this period, Egypt experienced a surge in capital inflows that was following changes made in 1991 to 1992, and net international reserves increased substantially by over $11 billion. And the graph shows in more detail the decrease in savings and investments, and that was occurring over this time, and it looks more closely around the 1991 period. That was the decrease in foreign savings.
So phase 2 was between 1993 and 1994. Phase 2 focused on Egypt trying to attract foreign institution investments and internal influences such as capital inflows. Egypt experienced decreases on nominal and real interest rates, which would stimulate investing and spending. This increased spending and investment would lead to liquidity growth and also an increase in equity prices. The stabilization of Egypt's economy in phase 1 and 2 that led to liquidity growth and strong equity prices would eventually lead to these capital inflows that Egypt was trying to attract during phase 2. The chart on the right shows the high consumer price inflation from the oil shocks that started in the 70s, and then shows the stabilization period that started in the 90s. You can see a sharp decrease from phase 1, and then the chronic inflation period from phase 2, and even a further decline in phase 3.
In phase 3, which again occurred between 1994 to 1997, we see inflation decrease from 13.8% to 7.6%. For the real GDP, there is an increase from 1.2% to 4.1%, higher than all previous phases during the 1990s. Also, for the debt to GDP, there is a decrease from 125.6% to 90.6%. And for the investment rates, the chart on the right shows that as the years go on, public investment rates decrease while private investment rates increase, showing confidence in their economy to invest.
This graph shows the GDP per capita spanning from 1992 to 2010, with a somewhat linear increase followed by a decrease in the 2000s and then gradual increase again. There was an increase in privatization and wealth accumulation over the period between 1992 and up until the 2000s, explaining the linear growth that is seen in the graph. During the early 2000s, there were several periods of riots, protests, and terrorism within Egypt, which is the reasoning behind the dip that is seen spanning from 2001 to around 2006. After 2006, the same linear growth that was seen in the beginning picks up again following a similar trend.
From the GDP growth rate graph, one can see that Egypt's initial GDP growth took a hit from the stabilization efforts of the IMF. This was transitory, and GDP growth started to reverse trend during Phase 2, which was during 1993 and 1994. GDP continued to increase during 1994 to 1997 during Phase 3 and increased yearly until 2001.
Looking at the exchange rate, we see during the economic development of Egypt, the Egyptian government pegs the Egyptian pound to the US dollar. Note before 1992, there was a period of devaluation to be competitive in the global market.
So now we'll take a look at general public reactions to the policy shifts that were enacted by the structural adjustment programs implemented by the International Monetary Fund. Throughout the latter half of the 20th century, Egypt went through a period of uncertainty as it struggled both politically and economically, culminating in the involvement of the IMF as an attempt to improve the economic situation. IMF involvement in Egypt actually began much earlier than the 90s, as a delegation advised the Egyptian government to reduce subsidies on consumer goods by up to 50% back in 1976. But after following this advice, there was rapid and violent pushback from the public, and the government was forced to double back on these changes and implement them over a more lengthy period of 30 years. After requesting aid from the IMF and undergoing structural adjustment programs in the early 90s, there was an increase in overall GDP, but much of the increase was funneled into the economic elite and private entities. Many workers experienced wage stagnation or reduction, which again resulted in widespread protest that continued and increased in severity over the next decade. This eventually culminated in the Arab Spring of the early 2010s, which is a period of general civil unrest and protest throughout North Africa.
Switching to look at the current economic outlook in Egypt, inflation from August to September 2021 saw an increase from 5.7% to 6.6%. By the end of the year 2021, there is a prediction that currency will be weakened, being at 15.81 Egyptian pounds per US dollar. For the entire fiscal year of 2020 and 2021, Egypt experienced a 3.3% economic growth. It is important to keep in mind the state of the world during 2020 with COVID-19, which obviously affect all economies. It is now predicted by the central bank that Egypt will have growth of 5.1% by the end of the fiscal year in 2021. For the years following, they have predicted growth of 5.5%. However, once again, it is important to consider that these predictions are made hoping that economies will not be hindered by COVID-19 as they were in 2020.
Do it.
In conclusion, there is some pros and cons of the intervention of the IMF in Egypt's economy. The pros were the Egyptian economy stabilized and economic crisis was avoided, increase in investments and overall production in the economy, the increase in international reserves, a decrease in budget deficit, and some cons were an increase in wage gap and stagnation of wages for lower class, political destabilization due to public discontent, and continued depreciation of currency against the dollar. Ultimately, the IMF is said to have benefited some but not all socioeconomic groups. A primary achievement of the IMF was stabilization of inflation, which was their main goal in stabilizing the economy, but the general public remains skeptical of supposed economic improvements.
And here are our citations.